Julia Gillard took Kevin Rudd's job on a pledge to fix things, but the situation's worse than ever.
I didn't direct anybody to write a speech in my office.
From poor opinion polls to an office that seems to be acting without her authority, it's hard to believe this is what her supporters wanted when they put her in the job.
The Prime Minister is more interested in saving her job than protecting your job.
We speak to one of her closest allies, Craig Emerson, plus Maverick National Barnaby Joyce and the Liberal Party's Simon Birmingham on Showdown.
Hello and welcome to Showdown. I'm Peter van Onselen. Well, I tell you what, if the Labor Party had a good week in Parliament last week, and most commentators agreed that they tactically won the week, boy, it's not happening so far this week, and we're only up to Tuesday, and they're probably already hoping to pack their bags, Labor MPs that is, and head on home. It has been a poor week in just the 2 days that we've had, and question time today was a good one for the opposition, a bad one for the government. Let's take a quick look at some of it. We've got Greg Hunt to get us rolling.
I refer the Prime Minister to her statement that the impact of the carbon tax on aluminium will be equivalent to a 1 cent rise in the dollar. Does she stand by that statement?
Yes, I do, Mr Speaker.
I refer the Prime Minister to Alcoa's 9 January 2012 earnings presentation that reveals the change in company earnings is $11 million for every 1 cent change in the Australian dollar. Given Alcoa's evidence to the Senate of a $40 million carbon tax bill for the Victorian operations alone, is the company misleading the market, or is the Prime Minister misleading the House?
The last thing I ever do is accept figures from the opposition because they're normally misrepresented.
Well, she should accept these ones because they are right. It's not often that you'll see me praise Greg Hunt, but he did a good job that time. But he wasn't the standout performer on the Liberal side in question time today. That was without doubt the Deputy Opposition Leader, Julie Bishop. Her question was a cracker.
I refer the Minister to last week's coup d'etat in the Maldives, where the democratically elected head of government was ousted by rival forces and his deputy installed. While the new leader of the Maldives says he did not bring about the coup, reports have surfaced that he was involved in coup preparations that began weeks earlier. Does the Foreign Minister agree that the new leader should tell the full truth about his involvement in the coup?
The best part about that, of course, is that Kevin Rudd knew all about what was going on in the Maldives and he was more than happy to talk to it. But it wasn't quite so stunning on the government side. Simon Crean, he tried to win a few punches for the government, but in the end he just ended up knocking out his Prime Minister. Let's have a look.
I say when you enter an agreement, you've got to honour it. And the agreement that was entered, Mr Speaker, was to ensure that there would be wood supply.
To ensure what? Who cares? When you enter an agreement, I believe it should be honoured. That's Simon Crean's words. You saw the face of Julia Gillard sitting next to him. Well, he could have been talking about the carbon tax. He could have been talking about her deal with Andrew Wilkie, who incidentally will be a guest on Australian Agenda on Sunday. We'll see what he thinks of that. It has been a bad start to the week, and really, let's face it, last night, Four Corners, that was a killer for the Prime Minister. Why she agreed to a long-form broadcast interview when she wasn't going to be prepared to answer the question is anyone's guess. I tell you, if she doesn't need the training of media training, maybe her staff do. Let's look at this shocking performance.
I am not surprised that whether it's people in my office or people more broadly in the government or the Labor Party were casting in their mind where circumstances might get to. Of course, political people look at political circumstances.
With respect, you haven't answered the question, and the question was, did you know that people in your office 2 weeks before Kevin Rudd was removed as Prime Minister were preparing a speech that you subsequently delivered?
I've given you the best answer I can, which is I'm not surprised that there were people, around government who were, in their own mind.
But did you know?
Well, I did not ask for a speech to be prepared.
But were you aware that one was being prepared?
Look, I've just given the best answer I can to your question.
My question was simply whether or not
I heard your question and I've answered it.
You haven't answered the question.
Well, I've given you the answer I'm going to give you.
Not a good look at all. I mean, we all know that politicians hardly ever answer the question, but that's at doorstops. That's when they're doing interviews on television where the clock is ticking and they've got 8 or 9 minutes. It happens all the time. It'll happen tonight, I have no doubt. But when you agree to a long-form broadcast interview that's pre-recorded, we're talking about hour after hour, you have to go into that expecting to answer questions. If you don't, you look tricky, and the Prime Minister looked tricky. But perhaps more tricky still was Kevin Rudd, because my understanding, on making a few calls and trying to get to the bottom of why she agreed to do this interview when Kevin Rudd wasn't doing one, is that Kevin Rudd left the impression, or at least his staff did, with the Four Corners crew that they were going to agree to this, and the Prime Minister only agreed to offer the comments that she did and participate in the interview was because she thought that Kevin Rudd was going to be involved as well. He, of course, pulled out at the last minute and left her looking bad. And that wasn't the only revelation from that. Joe de Bruin, important Labor power broker, he seems to well and truly have moved away from the Prime Minister and be in Kevin Rudd's camp. We have opinion polls coming out today that are shocking again for the government. They're not a good look. They're only going to add to more leadership speculation. And if that's not enough, our own Sky News colleague Peter Switzer, who runs a leadership lunch seminar series, well, he'd been working on Kevin Rudd to perhaps do one in the coming weeks, and he didn't have a no that was answered. That was still the clock ticking on whether that would happen. Today, of all days, Kevin Rudd's office came back and said, sorry, Mr Switzer, now's probably not the right time for me to do a lunch where I'm talking about leadership. Indeed, it's not. Maybe he'll do it as Prime Minister in a couple of months' time. Coming up on the Showdown tonight, we'll have Barnaby Joyce. First up, we'll then have Craig Emerson, close supporter of the Prime Minister, Dr Craig Emerson that is, and we'll round up with Simon Birmingham, who is a frontbencher in the opposition, but he's also a strong advocate of gay marriage. We'll see how he's going to reconcile the fact that Tony Abbott, as a frontbencher, doesn't want him to vote for gay marriage. All of that coming up shortly, but first, let's take a look at what's making news with Michael Willisey.
Thank you, Peter. The Prime Minister is under increasing pressure over the Labor leadership after revelations her staff were writing a victory speech 2 weeks before Kevin Rudd was rolled. The PM insists she only decided to challenge on the day she confronted Kevin Rudd, but her judgment is again being questioned.
On Valentine's Day, there's no love lost in Canberra.
If Julia Gillard gets a Valentine's Day card, it's not from Kevin.
There's plenty of love in the caucus for Kevin Rudd.
This time it's Julia Gillard being accused of fuelling leadership talk, albeit unintentionally.
We were asked by Four Corners to appear last night. I was told, my office was told, that this program would be about Labor in government since 2007.
The program instead focused on the Labor coup and the claim a senior Gillard staff member was drafting her victory speech 2 weeks before Kevin Rudd was rolled in June 2010.
I did not ask for a speech to be prepared.
But were you aware that one was being prepared?
Look, I've just given the best answer I can to your question.
Kevin Rudd was shadowed by the Four Corners crew, but refused repeated requests for an interview.
It showed a real lack of judgment for her to go on the Four Corners program last night.
My job is to answer questions and to explain what the government's doing. I'm not someone who runs away from questions.
Well, I write my own speeches.
Gillard supporters say there's nothing unusual about staff members penning speeches that may or may not be used.
When a staff member began writing a speech, I must say in my office, I wouldn't be aware.
I've checked with my office and there have been people scribbling in their preparations in case I get asked to take the Prime Ministership in the future.
It is yet another distraction for the government as it tries to keep the focus on the economy. But the real problem for Julia Gillard remains her flagging popularity, confirmed again by the latest news poll. It shows Julia Gillard's lead as preferred Prime Minister over Tony Abbott was short-lived, and Labor's two-party preferred position now trails the coalition by 10 points. Negative or not, the opposition message is cutting through, and Mr Abbott's mentor thinks he's working miracles.
If people are, particularly on the other side, are complaining about Tony and his colleagues being too negative, that tells me that they are being very, very effective.
David Lipson, Sky News, Canberra.
And joining me now from Canberra is Sky News political reporter Laura Jays. Well, Laura, last night's interview really seems to have set off a new round of leadership speculation.
Well, Michael, it certainly has raised questions about the events leading up to that leadership coup, but has also added fuel to the fire of the current leadership speculation, whether Kevin Rudd is at the moment angling to get his old job back. Now, in last night's interview, Julia Gillard said that she wasn't aware that a victory speech was being drafted by her office 2 weeks out from this historic change in leadership. She also said that she can't recall seeing any polling, but of course this interview last night raised more questions than it did answer any of those questions put to her. And so it has journalists in the press gallery, of course, digging. Laurie Oakes tonight revealed that one MP, in fact, said that she didn't just see the polling. In fact, she was shopping it round to other MPs. And this, of course, came from an unnamed MP. But look, all this has added fuel to the fire of leadership speculation this week. The second parliamentary week is playing out much like last week did, suffocating any of the policy areas that the government want to talk about, such as the economy and jobs. And of course, as you can imagine, Michael, the opposition is having an absolute field day with it.
Sure are, Laura. A bit of better news, though, for the government today. The private health insurance rebate soon to be means tested.
That's right. After securing the support of three crossbenchers, Robert Oakeshott, also Andrew Wilkie and the Greens MP Adam Bant. Now, this was a deal done especially with the Greens to secure the Greens' support in both the lower and the upper house. The government has agreed to put $165 million towards a dental scheme. Now, this is far less than what the Greens wanted, but they are celebrating this as a small victory. As you can imagine, this is something that the coalition is still railing against, and Tony Abbott is leading that. The debate is going on in the House at the moment, and this was Tony Abbott earlier this afternoon.
Labor hates private health insurance, and day after day, the now Prime Minister would stand up and come to the dispatch box and say, well, that was a lie. Well, wrong, Mr Speaker. It was the truth.
Order.
And of deception,
Order.
Mr Speaker.
The leader has used
strong language, Mr Speaker. And I don't apologise for using strong language, but I will tone it down
has cast
out of
a
respect for
reflection
you.
On the Prime Minister, and he will withdraw.
And I withdraw out of respect for you, not out of respect for this Prime Minister.
The leader will withdraw unconditionally.
I withdraw unconditionally out of respect for you, but not out of respect for this Prime Minister.
Tony Abbott having a bit of a tussle with the Speaker there this afternoon in this second reading of the private health rebate bill. Now, it was thought that this bill might be voted upon tonight. The House is rising at 11 p.m, and it looks like there's a number of coalition MPs filibustering this debate, so it looks like it may not be voted upon until tomorrow now, Michael.
Yeah, long night ahead. Laura, just finally, we've seen another side of how events played out on Australia Day.
Yeah, look, this is a story that it keeps on giving. We keep on seeing more revelations, and tonight on 7:30 report we saw the exact moment where Kim Sattler passed on the information that she had got from Tony Hodges. Take a look.
You want me to give you the details? Yeah. They're both in a reception at the Lobby restaurant, which is just up the corner, and Abbott's just made a statement to the press that 10 embassies should be pulled down. He's over there.
Our Deputy Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, is over there, and he's just made a statement to the press that the 10 embassies should be pulled down.
Tell everybody to go over there.
I was asked to put this message across. Can everybody go over that way?
Another insight to what sparked off those ugly and lasting scenes we did see on Australia Day that caused the Prime Minister and the opposition leader to be smuggled out of the Lobby restaurant. Now, it doesn't change things for the Prime Minister or change the words that Tony Hodges, in fact, said to Kim Sattler. So just another angle, if you like, Michael, on those ugly scenes that did play out.
OK, Laura Jay's in Canberra. Good talking to you, Laura. Thank you. Quick look at sport now. And former Australian players are split over Ricky Ponting's temporary appointment as one-day captain. Ponting will lead the Aussies against Sri Lanka at the SCG on Friday before handing control back to Michael Clarke in Brisbane on Sunday. Steve Waugh says selectors have made the wrong decision, with Dave Warner the future of Australian cricket.
That's the best of the...
Put Dave Warner in as vice-captain. I assume that they think he's leadership material, and if he's vice-captain, why can't he captain the side as well?
Waugh also says Brad Haddin's status needs to be clarified, with Matthew Wade selected as keeper.
If he's rested, why doesn't he come back in and be the captain? I mean, he's vice-captain in the Test side, so there was an opportunity for maybe Brad to be captain of the one-day team. It's a bit confusing, and it'd be good for someone to clear it up.
And Brett Lee could make a shock return from injury if he passes a fitness test on his broken toe. Tomorrow's weather: showers and storms in the east, hot in the south and over the interior. And that's the latest Sky News to this minute. Now it's back to Peter van Onselen with Showdown.
Thanks, Michael. We're going to take a commercial break. When we come back, we'll have Maverick National Party Senator Barnaby Joyce. Back in a moment. Welcome back. This is Showdown. I've been reading tweets coming in over the course of the break and emails as well, and it's funny, all the lefties telling me what a biased presenter I am because I'm sitting here and laying into the government and the Prime Minister for how they're going over the last 48 hours. Well, I'm sorry. On a re-evaluation, the Prime Minister's on fire. She's got nothing to worry about from the Four Corners show last night. No problems there. Kevin Rudd, he doesn't want the leadership back. No issues. All of these people that are backgrounding, including Laurie Oakes on his report tonight, that's all made up. Journalists, you just can't trust them. This is a complete beat-up and the opposition are fueling it, and we should really be ignoring it. So we'll talk about some of this with Barnaby Joyce, the Maverick Senator for the National Party, who joins us out of Canberra. Barnaby Joyce, thanks for your company.
My pleasure, Peter van Onselen.
We'll get straight into this, despite the accusations of bias. I mean, the only thing anyone is talking about is speculation about a Kevin Rudd comeback, the problems that Julia Gillard's got from her performance in the Four Corners interview last night. Let me ask you straight off the bat, what's more likely to happen? The opposition achieve a surplus or Kevin Rudd to come back as Prime Minister?
I think that Kevin Rudd will come back as Prime Minister first because that'll happen at the demise of this government. And after that happens, the whole show will hit the fan and we'll have an election, and then the next thing will be a surplus after that.
OK, so the surplus some way off, but the more likely scenario is a Kevin Rudd comeback.
Well, how can they go on like this? It's hopeless. I mean, all the backbenchers would say that, it's good night Irene for them. It's all over. They're going to lose their seat. It's finished. They've got to do something. They can't carry on like this. They can do the numbers. They can count. They go back and have a yarn to the people at the local corner pub. They'll tell you what's going to happen to you. You finish. You're for the high jump.
Honest question, and I know that the easy solution is to fudge it and say you don't care, you'll take on either of them. But if you had to choose, which one would you rather face off against at the next election, Kevin Rudd or Julia Gillard as Prime Minister? If you had to choose.
Really? Oh, well, if I had to choose, Kevin Rudd will come back with a sense of popularity that he's some sort of messianic figure until people realise why they got rid of him in the first place. So that people always get a bit of a bump as soon as they get back.
So that makes him the more risky option, yeah?
Well, if I was them, I wouldn't pick either of them. There you go. And that is the honest answer. I'd pick Stephen Smith or somebody boring. They need boring really badly. They really need boring, and they really need to get their books together, and that's about the best advice we can get. So pick Stephen Smith because he is exceptionally boring. Pick him.
It's interesting that you say that, though. I mean, I've heard some strategists on the Labor side actually talking about the value of Stephen Smith because his boringness, as you put it, same words they use, would stand in nice contrast to some of the more perhaps risky alternatives. Tony Abbott, yourself even, one of them mentioned. I mean, is that the same sort of theory that you're using to suggest that they should go to that kind of steady, boring pair of hands?
Well, look at it at the moment. It is like, Nightmare on Elm Street. It's just this sort of nutty charade going on. And you've got Julia Gillard on one hand who I honestly believe she's been advised by a 12-and-a-half-year-old truant. I don't know how on earth she gets herself into these pickles. And then you've got this other sort of megalomaniac figure in the corner. He's about to make his way back, and that's Kevin Rudd. And he's the same one who yelled at the Squadron 34 girl because she didn't deliver him the right, meal. He's the same one who had details sitting outside his house because he might go for walks at 2 o'clock in the morning. He's the same one who has these sort of manic approaches to things, and he's the one they sacked. And the person they reckon is the best replacement for the one they've got is the one they've sacked.
But maybe he's learned from his mistakes. I mean, the best replacement for the Liberal coalition leadership in 95 ended up being the one that they sacked back in 89, John Howard. Maybe Kevin Rudd's learned too.
I think there's a vast amount of difference between John Howard and Kevin Rudd. I'm not doubting Kevin Rudd's political attributes, and that in a glimpse of Kevin Rudd, he seems quite palatable, but in depth with Kevin Rudd, you've got serious problems. And the serious problems are held by every bureaucrat and each one of his colleagues. No one can judge you better, Peter, than your colleagues. And if your colleagues think that you're unpredictable, hopeless, unable to be worked with, then they judge you, they got rid of you, and they put in Julia Gillard, and and she's been worse.
All right, on economic matters, I mean, we've seen some bank bashing, we've seen interest rate movements, not in the direction that they ended up being expected to go at the start of last week, but in the other direction with the big four banks putting them up. But also, it's the fears of a global contagion on the back of what's going on in Greece and other parts of Europe as well. How serious a threat do you think the problems overseas economically are to the Australian economy?
Very serious. I think obviously what happens in the end is the contagion works its way through because everybody's connected up by reason of their financing arrangements. But economically, we are part of Southeast Asia. We've spent a couple of 100 years trying to realise that. We had Keating even say, realise where you are. It's only the Labor Party that every time they compare us economically, they want to take us back to Europe. They compare us our debt to Portugal and Greece and Spain and say, well, you know, we're much better than them. You know, the melanoma on our arm is far smaller than the melanoma on theirs, therefore we're healthy. But economically, we're part of Asia. We're being propped up by the Chinese demand, by the Indian demand. That's what's saving our bacon at the moment. But if Europe completely falls out of bed, well, the biggest export market for China is Europe. You know what's going to happen.
But what about the issues in terms of on your side of the parliament economically last week? Now, you were, in a sense, forced out of the shadow finance portfolio for reasons that we won't go into now, but your replacement, Andrew Robb, was at odds with his treasurer, shadow treasurer colleague, Joe Hockey. Now, you'd have to concede, wouldn't you, that whilst the differences might not be a big deal because you're in opposition, not in government, nonetheless, they do speak to a breakdown in their working relationship.
Well, what you're talking about in opposition is a commentary on the Labor Party position. The Labor Party create the platform, and all you can really do in opposition is talk about where they are. Now, it's not the cardinal sin when where they are is a moving feast. What you've seen with the Labor Party and where they are is they are at $224 billion in gross debt, and they have a $250 billion limit, and they will hit it. And when they hit it, it'll be like the 4th of July. What exactly do we do when we hit our third debt limit that they've created? What do we do? Do we just extend the limit and continue on in this sort of manic way, or do we try and pull the show back under control? What happens?
Well, who knows? But what happens on another issue is something I'd like to ask you about. It came in from a Twitter follower. He wants me to ask you what's going on with your move to the House of Representatives. You've indicated that you want to do that at the next election.
Yep.
Where's that at?
Well, I do. I've been completely open, and I've stated the same thing I said at the start. I've said it all the way through, and this is it. I live in Maranoa, so obviously my first choice is Maranoa. If I don't, if something, we have an incumbent member there at the moment, and if that doesn't work out...
How do you get rid of him?
Well, that's a choice. I don't get rid of anybody. That's the choice for himself and the party. It's not. I won't be getting rid of people unless they're from the Labor Party or independents. Obviously, the second choice is where I grew up, and where I grew up is New England, and that makes perfect sense. I've tried to be consistent with that all the way through. Yes, I want to go to the lower house.
It's a riskier option, though, isn't it, Senator? I mean, it's one that you'd have to think about because as much as Windsor has got himself in a bit of hot water supporting this government, he's still a popular local figure even despite that. It'd be a challenge.
Of course it is, Peter, but you've got to remember, when I actually got into this place, I stood in a Senate seat under my own steam with the National Party. I wasn't part of a coalition ticket. I had Pauline Hanson against me. I had One Nation against me. I had the Liberal Party against me. I had the Greens against me. I had the Democrats against me and the Labor Party against me. So I've taken risks before. I started my own accountancy practice and built it up. There's another risk. Moved up to Queensland and took my family there. There's another risk. I took them to Western Queensland and tried to make a life for myself out there. There's another risk. I'm not scared of risks, Peter, and in fact I like the challenge. You know, we're only on this planet once, and I'm happy to, throw the dice up and see where they land.
So just to clarify, no matter what happens, whether you have an incumbent member that retires and you go into an already national-held seat, or whether you challenge the likes of Windsor, one way or the other at the next election you'll be a House of Representatives candidate?
Well, I'll give it my best shot. Maybe I'll get there, maybe I won't. And if I don't, I suppose that's where the story ends, and that's life. You move on.
But you will be a House of Reps candidate at the next election, come hell or high water.
Well, I'm going to do my very best endeavours there, Peter. As you well know, the choice is not mine. It's an electorate council's choice. On the Conservative side of politics, you can put up your hand and say, I'm an applicant, but you can't say I've got the job. That is the job of the electorate council. The electorate council loves the greatest democratic right they have, and that is to select their candidate.
All right, Senator, final question. Let's go to the floods, which are right in your backyard of St George. Now, where are they at? Well, they're obviously in the press when they're happening, but in the days and weeks that follow, they tend to fall out of view. I want you to give us an assessment of what you know and how residents are coping now in the aftermath.
Yeah, it's going to be tougher. Look, Roma had 440 houses that were inundated. St George, we had about 34 houses that were affected by flood. They were affected by flood for the third time in 2 years. How would you feel if you had to, rip up the gyprock, rip up the skirting boards, rip out the carpets, replace your electrical goods, deal with the insurance company 3 times in 2 years? But the big one is Mitchell. And Mitchell, we're talking about people who, many of them are of meagre terms to start off with. And if you want to rip your heart out and see what it looks like, drive down the street where you see people of meagre terms with their meagre possessions on the footpath to be picked up by a dump truck. We have got to do something. This is not a Labor Party thing or a Conservative Party thing or a Liberal Party thing or a National Party thing. A decent nation looks after people in strife, and we have got to do something for them.
So more's got to be done. I mean, you don't say that in a partisan way, but you simply make the point that you want to see more done.
No, I know. No, not even. No, this is beyond politics. This is how decent Australians work, and we've got to work in our best endeavours to do the right thing. And I would not discredit the views. I would believe that Julia Gillard's views on that are just as strong as mine, and no less and no more. And the same with Tony Abbott. And on these issues, we are as one.
All right, Senator Barnaby Joyce, we'll leave it there. Appreciate you joining us on Showdown. Thanks for your company.
Good on you, Peter.
When we come back from the break, we'll be joined by Dr. Craig Emerson. He's the Trade Minister. He's one of the serious economic nuts in the government. He's also a close ally of Julia Gillard. We'll see how he thinks the government's travelling, and we'll talk to him about some of the economic issues on the horizon. Back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching Showdown, and we're joined now out of Parliament House by Dr. Craig Emerson, the Trade Minister. Dr. Emerson, thanks for your company.
That's a pleasure, Peter.
You know where we're going to go to start this interview. We've got to talk about Four Corners. We've got to talk about the leadership problems. You spoke about them earlier today. Now, I realise that
Is this a long-form interview?
It's not as long a form interview as the Prime Minister had on Four Corners.
So it sort of falls in between.
That's right.
I shouldn't be doing it according to your advice.
No, you can do this because I made the point in the editorial that you can avoid the questions here because it's harder because I've got a clock right there in front of me that's ticking away and I can't keep it for 2.5 hours.
You reckon we shouldn't be doing long-form interviews? Just go out and doorstops and do a little 30-second grab, turn on our heels and go back inside.
This is media tactics right here and now. You've wasted 45 seconds of my time. Let's get on with it. So, Julia Gillard, you're backing her, I realise that, but you also backed Kevin Rudd before the coup that occurred, which was Four Corners' topic of conversation. You must have a little bit of I told you so happening.
Well, I'm a strong supporter of Julia Gillard. She's a great leader, she's a reforming leader, and we're working very hard on policy, as we have in the previous years, to both grow the economy and modernise it and making sure that the benefits of that economic growth are fairly shared, including through the mining tax, which, as you know, Peter, would increase superannuation for working Australians, provide small business tax breaks and company tax breaks for those companies that are not in the fast lane. That's what we're concentrating on.
But this is a serious question because I've written about the fact that
I just gave you a serious answer.
Well, and to that, this is a serious point because I've written before about the fact that I think this government gets a harsher rap than it deserves. I've got criticisms, everyone does, but I don't think it's been as bad as a lot of its detractors say. Certainly not as bad as the opposition says. Now, Twitter will erupt and tell me now that I'm a crazy left-winger after calling me a crazy right-winger over the last 15 minutes of this program. But the serious question
I'll just agree you're crazy.
But the serious question for you out of this, and you're chewing up my time again, the serious question for you is...
Well, it's been a long question.
Like it or not, you've got a situation where the polls are bad, the speculation is all about Rudd, he's not going away. It's probably in his best personal interest for Julia Gillard to fail because that improves his personal legacy in justifying why he shouldn't have been rolled in the first place. How do you break out of all of that to make the messages that you're trying to sell be heard rather than sound like sound bites?
Well, you say I'm chewing up your time. That was a very long question, all about politics. My interest in the Parliament House, the reason I sought pre-selection was my interest in policy, and it is policy that interests the Australian people. It interests them.
But not at the moment, I don't think. At the moment, they wonder what's going on.
that's really a question of judgment, isn't it? Because I actually fundamentally believe, and certainly my mentor and someone I work for, Bob Hawke, believe that the Australians have a huge dose of common sense. They understand that the real debates that matter are the debates that affect issues such as interest rates, the cost of living, and very importantly, creating high-skilled, high-wage jobs for the future. They're the great debates, and sure, we're here. We're having a debate. You said it'd be on the economy. I didn't come down in the last shower. I knew that you'd spend a good slab of it on politics. I actually fundamentally believe that the Australian people are interested in policy.
Okay.
If you want to have an interview about politics, let's do it. But that's your judgment.
No, I'll come to what you want to talk about. We'll talk about policy now.
I'm happy to talk about whatever you want.
Well, let's go straight to jobs, because that was something that you raised today. Now, this was something that was raised by Simon Crean in his interview with David Spears in PM Agenda this afternoon. I'll just quickly play the clip for you.
But in our last 4 years, we've created more than 700,000 jobs. Howard's government, in their last 4 years, created less than 600,000 jobs.
OK, now he's right about the 700,000 jobs, but he's wrong about the 600,000. I've got the ABS data here. It's over 1 million jobs in the last 4 years of the Howard government.
Well, OK, I haven't got the ABS figures in front of me, but what I can absolutely confirm is that there have been 700,000 new jobs under this government. And if we want to do comparisons on the economy and those variables that affect jobs, interest rates, 4.25% under Labor, 6.75% under the coalition, a trade surplus of $19 billion last year. That is a record for a calendar year. Why is that important? It's not just a statistic. It means that our exporters, our farmers, our small businesses, even our manufacturers are benefiting from the policies that we've implemented. Accolades from the Reserve Bank, accolades from international institutions, and indeed, Peter, accolades from Tony Abbott when he said, when he went overseas, that our economic record here right now is enviable. But when he's back in Australia, he says, oh, it's all going really badly and there's all this debt and all this sort of stuff. When he's overseas and he's obligated to be non-partisan, he actually describes our economic performance as enviable. On that, Mr Abbott is right.
All right, fair point. But nonetheless, my point is, why is Simon Crean not referring to all the things you just did? Is it because he doesn't have a doctorate in economics just like you do? Maybe he's not aware of them. He's referring to a figure that I've got the data here is not right, a comparison that's probably the one that he should have avoided. But on another issue relating to the economy, now, your Trade Minister, the high Aussie dollar is a problem. Paul Howes wrote an article in the Sunday Telegraph about it. He's very concerned about it. He's very concerned that the Reserve Bank aren't passed in on aren't cutting interest rates, and the banks ipso facto aren't passing them on. As Trade Minister, do you agree with him that the high Aussie dollar is not something for Australians to be proud of, but rather something that we should be extremely worried about?
Well, it certainly is a burden, Peter, on our traded sector, that is our exporters and those businesses that are competing against imports. But at the same time, it's a vote of confidence in the Australian economy, because we've both got long-term investors putting in $450 billion worth of investment. Again, the Reserve Bank Statement of Monetary Policy on Friday said that we're going to have investment at a 50-year high as a share of GDP. That's what you get when you're putting $450 billion worth of investment into this country. That does force the dollar up. And what they're doing is they're punting on Australia because we are integrated into this region, the Asian region, in the Asian century, as a result of the foresight of previous Labor governments. We're building on that through the Asian Century White Paper exercise launched by Julia Gillard, and that's what we're talking about. Yes, there are some job losses. There's no doubt. No one wants those. But the economy is continuing to transform. We're going to not just sit back and let it happen. We're going to shape that transformation to produce a high-skill, high-wage economy for the future, so that all Australians, and not just the mining companies and a few rich individuals, get the benefits of the mining boom.
But going to this issue of the high dollar, I mean, do you think it's something that's here to stay? Because the sort of the boom that you're talking about, the realities of the zone that we're in the looming Asian century, I think that's all right. I agree with you, but it sort of sends the message, in a sense, doesn't it, that we've got this high dollar whether we like it or not, because we are a strong economy. Now, that being the case, where does that leave us in terms of the trade-exposed industries where the high dollar is a problem?
Well, in fact, many of our industries are succeeding in spite of the high dollar. And I'll give you an example, Peter. You know, we've been talking about manufacturing, and yes, it is certainly under pressure. But manufactured exports of highly sophisticated goods to China in the last decade have increased 230% from Australia. And our exports of those same goods to the United States and the United Kingdom have actually declined by more than 20%. So this is a good example of Australian manufacturers actually being able to compete successfully here in our own region, exporting into China despite the high dollar.
So
and we'll continue to work with
with
those
the car
businesses.
sector then, in terms of the elements that are struggling, and indeed aluminium and so forth? What is the key difference? Serious question.
Well, the key consideration here is that the car industry itself is continuing to modernise, and I know that there's this critique that has come from some quarters that we shouldn't be supporting the car industry at all, in any way, shape or form, for any purpose. I've had a look at the effective rates of protection for the automotive industry in this country, and in fact it was the Hawke Keating government that started reducing that, and it's been falling gradually for 20 years, Peter. Now, at current levels, it is a very low level in historical terms, but we actually believe that the car industry has a strong future in this country, but it does need some co-investment from a government. We're prepared to do that. You want alternatives? Mr Abbott said he'd yank $500 million out of that. Sophie Mirabella has been running around saying we're the manufacturing workers' friends. Tony Abbott, the same thing, the hard hats, the vests and all that sort of stuff. But in fact what they want to do is take $500 million out of support, and just as on the steel transformation plan. Peter, I was in the Parliament late at night when we separated the support for the steel industry from the carbon pricing legislation, allowing Mr Abbott and his team to vote for the steel industry. He led the noes. He said the noes have it, and of course they all fell in behind him. And yet he has the temerity to go around steelworks saying he's their friends. He'd cut their throats. Cut their throats.
Final question, given that you chewed up all my time, Dr Emerson. I saw an article
Speaking
today...
about economics.
Well, this is on an entirely different topic. I saw an article in The Australian today in the A+ section that said that you were one of the MPs that hadn't yet declared your hand on where you sit on the issue of gay marriage. Now, there's a number of private members' bills that are going before the Parliament. What is your view on this? Are you generally in favour of it or generally opposed to it?
Well, my view is reflected in no fewer than 10 transcripts going back to mid-2009, which I've now sent to the Australian newspaper, and including statements yesterday on radio in the morning reaffirming my position, which has been a simple position, that is, I believe marriage is a union between a man and a woman. I've said it 10 times. I've just said it an 11th time.
All right, fair enough. I wasn't meaning to get my colleague into trouble there at the Oz, but there you go.
Well, I'm just giving you the facts.
Dr Craig Emerson, we appreciate you joining us on Showdown, as always. Thanks for your company.
Rightio. Thanks, Peter.
When we come back from the break, we'll continue talking about gay marriage as well as other wider issues with Simon Birmingham, frontbencher for the opposition, Senator as well. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching Showdown. Perils of live television. You get media releases all the time from politicians. Sometimes they're interesting. 99.9% of the time they are not. An example of one that's not from the Greens that came in yesterday. They welcome Rio's attempt to protect the new crab. God, who cares? I mean, let's be honest. I mean, that's the kind of press release that is a waste of paper that you would think that the Greens would be well aware of. But a more interesting press release that actually did come through today, it's a bit of a Dorothy Dixer question for our next guest, which is Senator Simon Birmingham from the opposition frontbench. Senator, thanks for your company.
Good evening, Peter. Good to be with you.
A press release that came through from Simon today. Taxpayers still owed millions of dollars over home insulation. It's an interesting point where he goes through a whole range of issues where, in fact, there are installers and so forth that actually still owe money back to the government. Senator, I'll just ask you to take us through the details.
Well, Peter, I'm sure many people would think and would indeed have hoped that this whole sorry saga of the home insulation scheme was over, but yet it continues to drag along. The $2.5 billion home insulation program that was originally so botched up under the Rudd government, the clean-up of it continues to be botched up under the Gillard government.
Yeah, but so it wasn't your political lines that I thought were the good part of the press release. It was the detail of the outstanding money. There's letters of demand to installers and so forth. Jump on from there that have got millions of dollars of taxpayers' money that's still owing.
Well, there are three categories of demands that have gone out. There indeed is around $26 million of taxpayer funds still to be recovered under this program. They've gone to invoice companies that they think are still in operation. Around 2,000 invoices have been sent out to those companies. The government has also gone out to administrators of now defunct insulation companies, trying to chase debts there, and indeed for what was meant to be an industry assistance program, they are bizarrely chasing down debts for that industry assistance program as well, of people who managed to get their hands on money that they weren't entitled to or eligible to. But the thing about all of this is most of the invoices went out in March of last year. So we all know if you put an invoice out and it's not paid within a year, you're going to have a hard time
You're not getting the money back.
Getting that money back.
You're not getting the money back. Now, you found this out in Senate estimates just today, was it? Yesterday.
It was late yesterday that we found it out, Peter. But so that's right, $25 million that was wrongly given out by the government to insulation companies who either put in dodgy insulation or just didn't, of course, put it in the first place and wrongly claimed it. Most of that money just won't be recovered and it's vanished into people's pockets right around the country.
Now, something that's not in the press release is, were there any questions there to the relevant people appearing before the estimates about the likelihood of it coming back, even in percentage terms, or because it's a year on, as you say, since the letters of demand were sent out, is the assumption that there's not even going to be a 10% or a 20% recovery? This is worse than the bondholders of Greece.
Well, what we did establish is that the government is basically to the point of giving up on its own capacity to get the money back and is negotiating with a debt collection agency now. So how much of it we're going to get back from that is anybody's guess, and the government couldn't give us any exact estimates or figures. They claim to be in the final stages of negotiations with a debt collection agency, but that's where we're up to, it seems, under this government at present. We have the Department of Environment engaging debt collection agencies to try to get money back off of people that the government gave to them in the first place.
All right, well, it's not often that MPs write press releases that are interesting, but well done on that one.
Thanks, mate.
A question that may not be as interesting. Gay marriage. Now, you have come out publicly, which, let's face it, as a Liberal moderate is a good thing in my view, and you are in favour of gay marriage. You've done that where most of your colleagues probably aren't. Certainly the Conservative wing of the party is unlikely to be in favour of it. Now, we also have a situation that's developed now where Tony Abbott has made it clear to his front bench, and you're a member of that, that he expects them to vote as a bloc because there is a commitment from the last election that the coalition would not support an adjustment to the Marriage Act. Now, that puts you in a bit of a bind, doesn't it? It forces you to essentially vote against something that you believe in.
Well, Peter, we have a process to go through in the coalition and in the coalition party room. We haven't seen legislation be brought to that party room as yet. As you well know, the legislation's only just been introduced in the last couple of days in relation to same-sex marriage, so it will come to the coalition party room. That's where I've indicated that I'll get to have my say, and my firm belief, as I've said on the record before, is that this should be a matter of conscience vote. It should be a conscience vote across both parties, but in particular it should be one in the Liberal Party, and a few reasons for that. Firstly, because I think it is the type of issue on which so many views are informed by people's religious, moral or ethical considerations, that really these are the types of issues that should be considered as a conscience vote. But secondly, because the traditions of the Liberal Party are that we have always granted all of our members greater freedoms than does the Labor Party. We, of course, do that on every single vote.
But let's cut to the chase on this issue here, Mr Birmingham. I mean, the reality is that Tony Abbott is expecting his front bench to vote as a bloc to honour an election commitment from the last election. Whatever the design of the legislation that gets put forward, in essence, you support the concept of gay marriage. Now, those two things don't go together. It's a square hole, round block. What do you do?
Look, it's not an easy situation. I don't dispute that. Tony, indeed, is trying to honour his word to the last election.
But what about your word to your own personal beliefs, though? This is the tough one.
This is a tough one, and in the end I'll make my decisions when matters come before the party room as to the argument I take to our party room, and ultimately to the Senate if and when we see a vote brought on in the Senate at some stage this year. But look, I think this is an issue that there are many passionate views about. It's also an issue that a large proportion of Australians aren't terribly fussed about either way, and that's probably the bulk of all Australians. But for those extreme views of either side. The one appeal I'd make is let's have a sensible debate this year, and let's have not one that doesn't involve slanging at each other. But I'll be taking my views, as I've made clear before, to the party room, and I'll be having my debate there, and then we'll see where that goes once the party room's formalised the coalition position.
All right, but just between you and me, I mean, what's your position likely to be going in there? I mean, the reality is that you've come out. I mean, it must. By the way, my producer told me that when I said you came out, it sounded like I might have accidentally accused you of being gay. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but, your personal life's your own business. I was referring to the fact that you came out in favour of the concept of gay marriage. But on this issue, doing that, you were one of the few Liberals that actually did that in the process of this debate late last year. Now, having done that, is this something, let me come at this another way, is this an issue that you would be prepared to resign from the front bench over, or would you rather be in a situation where Tony Abbott as leader perhaps gave you the grace to do what Liberals sometimes are allowed to do and cross the floor? My suspicion is he'd do the latter because you're seen as a bit of a rising star in the Liberal Party, might I say.
Well, I think it's safe to say that given those two options, I would rather have the latter, and that's the question you put to me, that which would I rather, and I would rather, of course, this to be a conscience vote. And that's primarily what I've argued for. I think that's the important threshold question for the Liberal Party to debate. I don't think we should any more tie our members in one direction than we should in the other. I hope that we can still achieve that, but I understand Tony's argument, and it is an important one about wanting to honour his word to the electorate. And so we've got to work through those competing issues of there being a diversity of views, but the Liberal Party has often been described as a broad church. Some, like yourself, sometimes criticise it as not being broad enough. Well, hopefully I'm living proof that we are still a broad church and that we can have these debates, but do them sensibly and constructively.
Well, as long as you're allowed to cross the floor and don't get dumped from the front bench, I'll agree with you on that. But we've only got a little over a minute on program, so let me give you the free kick on your view on how the things are going on the Labor side. I asked Barnaby Joyce this same question. What's more likely to happen, do you think? A Kevin Rudd return to the leadership or the Liberal Party deliver a surplus as promised?
Well, I can tell you on the surplus front, if Wayne Swan is telling the truth, then the Liberal Party will be delivering a surplus in its first year in government because he's claiming the books are all looking good on track to go into surplus before we get there.
I love the way that Liberals do that because you don't think that he's telling the truth on this. I mean, Liberals say that in media conferences all the time, yet at the same time you rely on that, or at least Joe Hockey does, when trying to say that the surplus will be achieved as the opposition claims.
And this, of course, is the problem, trying to predict what we will do ahead of the election campaign when we see the final state of the books. So, of course, until you know whether Wayne Swan has told the truth for the next 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, depending on how long it is until we have an election, we can't possibly forecast how bad the budget will look at that stage. But thankfully the Howard government passed the Charter of Budget Honesty. It means the books have to be thrown open before the campaign or at the beginning of the campaign, and that means that we will be able to lay out costings to say we will bring the budget back to surplus, if indeed it is still in deficit, as I suspect it will be under the Labor government, or if it is in surplus, we can forecast how big our surpluses may be. But in the end, Wayne Swan is the current Treasurer. If he is claiming it's going back into surplus, well then we'll keep it in surplus, I've got no doubt about it. But if it's in deficit, then we'll tell you how long it will take to get it back to surplus. But we'll get there.
All right, Senator Simon Birmingham, I've got zeros across the clock on the top. We are out of time. Producers are screaming at me. I appreciate you joining us on Showdown. Thanks for your company.
Pleasure, Peter. Thanks, mate.
And thank you for your company. We will be back at the same time next week where we'll be joined by, amongst others, Peter Dutton, the Shadow Health Minister. See you then.